So my research is rooted in a philosophical background in John Dewey's work and other scholars like John Rawls who write about justice. And I'm very much interested in, and fundamentally interested in, how ideas matter and make a difference in the policy realm. At the same time, there's basically two levels at which my research operates. On the one hand, there's sort of like big ideas and principles and values and things like, you know, what democracy is about and what it requires for education and what a democratic education thus, you know, implies and needs, right, in order to function well for our society. But I also am very interested in the very, you know, fine particulars in policy about particular practices which conflict or support the bigger picture ideas and issues. So for example, I'm writing a book right now that I'm finishing called A Culture of Justice, in which I'm thinking about the ways in which culture can enable or inhibit the pursuit of justice. And, you know, there are ways in which an education is at the heart of the transference of culture to the next generation. And thus, what kind of education do we want for a democratic society? Well, it ought to be one which empowers citizens to have a sense of their own positive power in the world, right? This is something I get from John Dewey. Now, that kind of sounds like big, broad brush ideas, but it has an awful lot to say about particular, you know, policy issues. One example is the topic of discipline and how ought we discipline young people for the sake of a democratic education. And there are 19 states in the United States, including the state of Kentucky, in which it's still permissible, according to the law, to engage in corporal punishment, the striking of children physically, in order to discipline them. And it is the conclusion of my research, as well as a point of my own argument and advocacy, that it seems to me that if you want to encourage people to have a sense of their positive power, one of the things you need to do is to enable them to appreciate how and why you might ask an authority figure a question. And if children are hit in school for disrespecting teachers, are they more or less likely to ask a question? I believe they're less likely. But in addition, there's also all kinds of arguments to think about what democratic discipline ought to look like, and how can we best empower citizens, and nevertheless also need to discipline them sometimes, right? We want the right kinds of practices for managing classrooms, right? And so you can get into the details about methods and particular policies about which there are court cases and important leadership decisions to make. Another that I've written about is about sex education policy. And in the state of Mississippi, for instance, which I've studied a lot, they have troubling policies about sex education because they enable a few people to make decisions about a lot of people's options, minimizing that so that students don't get the comprehensive sex education that parents want them to have. And so there's other ways of doing things which can allow people to opt out if they wish, but allow others to get what they want as well. But that wasn't the policy chosen. So these are examples of the ways in which I would encourage people to think about the values we're trying to advance and pursue as a society, and the ways in which those values apply and ought to suggest certain policy decisions for our lives and our kids. And that also has impacts and applications at the level of higher education as well. So there's a number of things I'm interested in, and at the same time, I still think it's really fun and important to think about the big picture ideas, about what are we trying to do, because there's a lot of disagreement about that already, you know, let alone in the particulars of policy. But I think it's crucial for people to appreciate the ways in which these big picture ideas have implications for the particular policy matters that we need to decide together. So these are the kinds of things I study. I study the big policy issues like this book, A Culture of Justice, and I'm writing a paper on corporal punishment. I've written about sex education, about issues about Confederate monuments on college campuses, you know, and what symbols do to frustrate or enable the pursuit of justice, and how we ought to think about these things when certain symbols can be popular and yet demeaning, right? So these are some of the examples of challenges that my research focuses on and that really, you know, get me invigorated and want to keep writing.